from last week when we did World War One. I did part one, but now we're going to do part two. But before we get into that, I do want to announce that famous actress Diane Keaton died yesterday. Um, she was 79 years old, and she was best known for her roles in Godfather 1, 2, and 3 as Al Pacino's wife. She started off in the first one as his girlfriend, then she became his wife. And then the second one, they were married, but they end up divorcing at the end of the second movie. And then in the third one, she comes back and reprises her role as his ex-wife. And then she was also known for Father of the Bride 1 and 2, but I never saw those two. But I do remember her from Godfather 1, 2, and 3 because I own those three movies. Um, so we have that. And then this is also my vacation week from UPS. So I'm not working this week from at UPS because of my vacation. So on Friday, I did take a trip down to the city for a couple tourist destinations. I went to the museum. I went to the Museum of Science and Industry, which I did record a live stream of that on my other YouTube channel, RBW King, and then also you can check out my pictures that I posted from the zoo on Friday, which I went to Brookfield Zoo and took pictures of the animals there because I love animals. So now let's get into it. World War One. This is part two. So we're starting off with the aftermath of. So we got Austria. Austria-Hungary was partitioned into several successor states, largely but not entirely along the ethnic lines. The ethnic lines, apart from Austria and Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Italy, Poland, Romania, and Yugoslavia, they received territories from the dual monarchy, the formerly separate and auto-anonymous Kingdom of Croatia-Slovenia, which was incorporated into Yugoslavia. Now, the details were contained in the treaties of Saint-Germain en Laye and Trianon. As a result, Hungary lost 64% of its total population, and it decreased from 20.9 million people to 7.6 million, and they lost about 31%, 3.3 out of 10.7 million of its ethnic Hungarians. According to the 1910 census, the 1910 census basically, speakers of the Hungarian language included approximately 54% of the entire population of the Kingdom of Hungary. Now, within the country, numerous ethnic minorities were present. 16.1%. 16.1% of the were Romanians. 10.5% were Slavics. 10.4% were German. 2.5 Ruthenians. 2.5% were Serbian, and 8% were others. Between 1920 and 1924, 354,000 Hungarians fled former Hungarian territories that were attached to Romania, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. Now, the Russian Empire, lost much of its western frontier as the newly independent nations of Estonia, Finland, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland were carved from it, and Romania took control of Bessarabia in April of 1918. Now, after 123 years, Poland re-emerged as an independent country. The Kingdom of Serbia and its dynasty as a minor entente nation and the country with the most casualties per capita became the backbone of a new multinational state, the Kingdom of Serbs, Croatians, and Slovenians. Later it was renamed Yugoslavia. Now, Czechoslovakia, combining the Kingdom of Bohemia with parts of the Kingdom of Hungary, became a new nation. Romania would unite all Romanian-speaking people under a single state, leading to Greater Romania. Now, in Australia and New Zealand, the Battle of Gallipoli became known as those nations' baptism of fire. Now, it was the first major war in which the newly established countries fought, and it was one of the first times that Australian troops fought as Australians and not just subjects of the British Crown. And independent national identities for these nations took hold. Anzac Day, named after the Australian and New Zealand Army Corporation known as Anzac, commemorates this defining moment. Now, in this aftermath of World War I, Greece fought against Turkish nationalists led by Mustafa Kemal, a war that eventually resulted in a massive population exchange between the two countries. Under the Treaty of Lausanne, according to various sources, several 100,000 Greeks died during this period, which was tied into the Greek genocide. Now, the total number of military and civilian casualties in World War I was about 40 million people, and the estimates range from around 15 to 22 million deaths and about 23 million wounded military personnel. Now, ranking it among the deadliest conflicts in human history before World War II came along, the total number of deaths include between 9 and 11 million military personnel, with an estimated civilian death toll of about 6 to 13 million. And you got some pictures here. This is a picture of men transporting a wounded Ottoman soldier. Now you go down here, and then you'll see another picture of what looks like emergency military personnel hospitalized during the Spanish flu pandemic at a camp in Funston, at a camp in Kansas in 1918. So, now, of the 60 million European military personnel who were mobilized from 1914 to 1918, an estimated 8 million were killed, 7 million were permanently disabled, and 15 million were seriously injured. Now, Germany lost 15% of its active male population, and Austria-Hungary lost about 17%, and France lost about 10.5%. France mobilized 7.8 million men, of which 1.4 million died and 3.2 million were injured. Approximately 15,000 deployed men sustained gruesome injuries that were facial, causing social stigma and marginalization, and they called this the broken face syndrome. In Germany, civilian deaths were at 434,000, higher than in peacetime, due in large part due to food shortage and malnutrition that had weakened the disease resistance. Now, these excess deaths were estimated as 271,000 in 1918, plus another 71,000 on the first half of 1919 when the blockade was still in effect. Starvation caused by famine killed approximately 100,000 people in Lebanon, sorry. Spacing out here. Now, diseases flourished in the chaotic wartime condition. In 1914 alone, loose-borne epidemic typhus killed about 200,000 people in Serbia. And starting in early 1918, a major influenza epidemic known as the Spanish flu spread across the world, accelerated by the movement of large numbers of soldiers that were often crammed together in camps and transport ships with poor starvation. And also with poor sanitation, too. The Spanish flu killed at least 17 to 25 million people, and included an estimated 2.64 million Europeans and as many as 675,000 Americans between the year 1915 and 1926. An epidemic of encephalitis lethargia affected nearly 5 million people worldwide. And 8 million equines, mostly horses, donkeys, and mules, died, and 3/4 of them from the extreme conditions that they worked in. Oh, shit, fucker. Okay. Now this is French soldiers making a gas and attack flame on German trenches in the Flanders. Let's see up here. Okay, no, that's not it. Okay. And then down here, you can see the Armenians killed during the Armenian genocide. But yet, yeah, this is pretty fucking gruesome. All this shit. Now, the German army was the first to successfully deploy chemical weapons during the Second Battle of Ypres between April and May of 1915. After German scientists under the direction of Fritz Haber at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute developed a method to weaponize chlorine, um, the use of chemical weapons has been sanctioned by the German High Command to force Allied soldiers out of their entrenched positions. Um, Complementing rather than supplementing more lethal conventional weapons, chemical weapons were deployed by all major belligerents throughout the war, inflicting approximately 1.3 million casualties, of which about 90,000 were lethal and fatal. The use of chemical weapons in warfare was as a direct violation of the 1899 Hague Declaration concerning asphyxiating gases and the 1907 Hague Convention on Land Warfare, which prohibited that use. Um, Now, the ethnic cleansing of the Ottoman Empire's Armenian population, which included mass deportations and executions during the final years of now the ethnic cleansing of the Ottoman Empire's Armenian population, including mass deportations and executions during the final years of the Ottoman Empire, was considered to be a genocide. Now, the Ottomans carried out organized and systematic massacres of the Armenian population at the beginning of the war, and they manipulated acts of Armenian resistance by portraying them as rebellions. But with the Armenian resistance portraying them as rebellions to justify further extermination. Now, in early 1915, several Armenians volunteered to join the Russian forces, and the Ottoman government used this as a pretext to issue the Chester law, which was law on deportation. Now, which authorized the deportations of Armenians from the empire's eastern provinces to Syria between 1915 and 1918. The Armenians were intentionally marched to death, and a number were attacked by Ottoman brigands. Now, while the exact number of deaths is unknown, the International Association of Genocide Scholars estimates around 1.5 million people have died. The government of Turkey continues to deny the genocide to the present day, arguing that those who died were victims of inter-ethnic fighting, famine, or disease during World War I, and these claims are rejected by most historians who study this stuff. Now, other ethnic groups were similarly attacked by the Ottoman Empire during this period, including Assyrians and Greeks, and some scholars consider those events to be part of the same policy of extermination. At least 250,000 Assyrian Christians, about half of the population, and 350,000 to 750,000 Anatolian and Pontic Greeks were killed between 1915 and 1922. Now, about 8 million soldiers surrendered and were held in prisoner of war camps during the war. All nations pledged to follow the Hague Conventions on fair treatment of prisoners of war, and the survival rates for prisoner of wars were generally much higher than that of the combatants at front. Around 25 to 31% of Russian losses as a proportion of those captured, wounded, or killed were to prisoner status for Austria-Hungary, 32% for Austria-Hungary, Italy 26%, and for France 12%, and for Germany 9%, and Britain 7%. Now prisoners from the Allied armies totaled about 1.4 million people, not including Russia, which lost about 2.5 to 3.5 million soldiers as prisoners, and from the Central Powers, about 3.3 million soldiers became prisoners, and most of them surrendered to Russians. Now here, you see the photo of British prisoners guarded by Ottoman forces after the First Battle of Gaza in 1917. Now, the Allied personnel was about 42,928,000, while Central personnel was nearly 25,248,000. British soldiers of the war were initially volunteers, but were increasingly conscripted. Surviving veterans returning home often found that they could discuss their experiences only among themselves, so they formed the Veterans Association or the Legion, which I know about that one, the Legion, or they also had the BFW halls. Um, Now, conscription was common in most European countries, but it was controversial in English speaking countries. Now, it was especially unpopular among minority ethnicities, especially the Irish Catholics in Ireland, Austria, and the French Catholics in Canada. In the U.S., conscription began in 1917 and was generally well received, with a few pockets of opposition in isolated rural areas. Um, the administration decided to rely primarily on conscription rather than voluntary enlistment to raise military manpower after only 73,000 volunteers enlisted out of the initial 1 million target in the first 6 weeks of war. Now, this is a very popular picture that you will see in most places. That's Uncle Sam. Um, it's the U.S. Army recruiting poster with Uncle Sam in 1917, where he talks about "I want you for war," basically, or the U.S. Army. That picture is almost everywhere that you see, even on postage stamps too. So military and civilian observers from every major power closely followed the course of the war, and many were able to report on events from a perspective somewhat akin to modern embedded positions with the opposing and land and naval forces. Um, macro and microeconomic consequences devolved from the war. Um, Families were altered by the departure of many men. With the death or absence of the primary wage earner, women were forced into the workforce in unprecedented numbers. At the same time, the industry needed to replace the lost labor sent to war, and this aided the struggle for voting rights for women. Um, Now, in all nations, the government's share of GDP increased, surpassing 50% in both Germany and France, and nearly reaching that level in Britain. To pay for purchases in the U.S., Britain cashed in its extensive investments in American railroads and then began borrowing heavily from Wall Street. And the president at the time, Woodrow Wilson, was on the verge of cutting off the loans in late April 1916, but he allowed a great increase in U.S. government lending to the Allies. Um, After 1919, the U.S. demanded repayment of these loans, and the repayments were in part funded by German reparations that, in turn, were supported by American loans to Germany. Now, the circular system collapsed in 1931, and some loans were never repaid. But Britain is still owed the United States $4.4 billion of World War I debt in 1934. The last installment was finally paid off in 2015. Um, And here's a poster of women working back at this time. Most of the men did all the work, but this is about the time that women were started being allowed to work instead of being the housewife type people. So at the top you see the woman. Look, I don't know what she's doing at the top there, but then you see women workers on the bottom working in some type of factory. Um, Now, Britain turned to her colonies for help in obtaining essential war materials, whose supply from traditional sources had become difficult. Now, geologists such as Albert Kitson were called on to find new resources for precious minerals in the African colonies. Um, Now, Kitson discovered important new deposits of manganese used in munitions productions in the Gold Coast. Um, Article 231 of the Treaty of Versailles, which is known as the so-called War Guilt Clause, stated that Germany accepted responsibility for all the loss and damage to which the Allied and associated governments and their nationals have been subjected to as a consequence of the war imposed upon them by the aggression of Germany and her allies. It was worded as such to lay a legal basis for reparations, and a similar clause was inserted into the treaties with Austria and Hungary, and however neither of them interpreted it as an admission of war guilt. Um, But in 1921, the total reparation sum was placed at 132 billion gold marks. However, Allied experts knew that Germany could not pay this sum. The total sum was divided into three categories, with the third being deliberately designed to be chimerical, and its primary function was to mislead public opinion. It was into believing the total sum was being maintained, and thus 50 billion gold marks, $12.5 billion, represented the actual Allied assessment of Germany capacity to pay, and therefore represented the total German reparations figure that had to be paid off. Now, this figure could be paid in cash or in kind, coal, timber, chemical dyes, etc. Now, some of the territory lost via the Treaty of Versailles was credited towards the reparation figure, as were other acts such as helping to restore the liberty of Louvain. Now, by 1929, the Great Depression caused political chaos throughout the world. In 1932, the payment of reparations was suspended by the international community, by which point Germany had paid only the equivalent of 20.598 billion gold marks. No. Now, with the rise of Trump's idol, Adolf Hitler, all bonds and loans that had been issued and taken out during the 1920s and early 1930s were canceled. Now, David Andelman notes refusing to pay doesn't make an agreement null and void. Now, the agreement still exists. Thus, following the Second World War at the London Conference in 1953, Germany agreed to resume payment on the money borrowed. On October 3rd of 2010, Germany made the final payment on all these bonds. Now, the Australian Prime Minister Billy Hughes wrote to the British Prime Minister David Lloyd George, "You have assured us that you cannot get better terms. I much regret it and hope even now that some way it may be found of securing agreement for demanding reparation that commensurate with the tremendous sacrifices made by the British Empire and her allies." Australia received 5,571,720 in war reparations, but the direct cost of the war to Australia had been about 376,993,052, and by mid-1930s, reparation pensions, war gratuities, interest, and sinking fund charges were at $831 million, which is really kind of high. Now, in the Balkans, Yugoslav nationalists such as the leader Ante Trumbic strongly supported the war, desiring the freedom for Yugoslavians from Austria-Hungary and other foreign powers and the creation of independent Yugoslavia. The Yugoslavian Committee, led by Trumbic, was formed in Paris on April 30th of 1915, but shortly moved its office to London, England. In April of 1918, the Rome Congress of oppressed nationalities met, including Czechoslovakia, Italian, Polish, Transylvanian, and Yugoslavian representatives, who urged the Allies to support the national self-determination for the peoples residing with the Austria-Hungary. Here's a picture of, and I've seen this one before too. The women win the war, and so I get. Now, in the Middle East, Arab nationalism soared in Ottoman territories. Now, okay, so in the Middle East, Arab nationalism soared in Ottoman territories in response to the rise of Turkish nationalism during the war. Now, Arab nationalist leaders advocated for the creation of a pan-Arab state. In 1916, the Arab revolts began in Ottoman-controlled territories of the Middle East to achieve their independence. In Eastern Africa, Iyasu V of Ethiopia was supporting the Dervish state, who were at war with the British in the Somaliland campaign. Von Cyberg, the German envoy in Addis Ababa, Ababa said, "Now the time has come for Ethiopia to regain the coast of the Red Sea, driving the Italians home to restore the empire to its ancient size." Now, the Ethiopian Empire was on the verge of entering World War I on the side of the Central Powers before Iyasu's overthrow at the Battle of Sagali, due to Allied pressure on the Ethiopian aristocracy. Um, Now, several socialist parties initially supported the war when it began in August of 1914, but European socialists split on national lines with the concept of class conflict led by radical socialists such as Marxists and syndicalists being overborne by their patriotic support for the war. Um, Now, once the war began, Austrian, British, French, German, and Russian socialists followed the rising nationalist current by supporting their country's intervention in the war. Um, Now, Italian nationalism was stirred by the outbreak of the war, and was initially strongly supported by the variety of political factions. Now, one of the most prominent and popular Italian nationalist supporters of the war was a guy named Gabriele D'Annunzio, and who promoted Italian irredentism and helped sway the Italian public to support intervention in that war. The Italian Liberal Party, under the leadership of Paolo Boselli, promoted intervention into the war on the side of the Allies, and used the Dante Alighieri Society to promote Italian nationalism. Italian socialists were divided on whether to support the war or oppose it, but some were militant supporters of the war, including Benito Mussolini and Leonida Biscatelli. However, the Italian Socialist Party decided to oppose the war after anti-militarist protesters were killed, resulting in a general strike called Red Week. Now, the Italian Socialist Party purged itself of pro-war nationalist members, including Benito Mussolini. Benito Mussolini formed the pro-interventionist party, and which was called Revolutionary Fasci for international action. In October of 1914, that later developed into the Fasci Italianini combatant party in 1919, the origin for fascism. Now, 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 Benito Mussolini's nationalism enabled him to raise funds from Ansaldo, an armaments firm, and other companies to create another party to convince socialists and revolutionaries to support that war. Shit, man, I'm getting there. So on both sides, there was a large-scale fundraising for soldiers' welfare, their dependents, and those injured. The nailmen were a German example around the British Empire. There were many patriotic funds, including the Royal Patriotic Fund Corporation, the Canadian Patriotic Fund, and the Queensland Patriotic Fund. And by 1919, there were 983 funds in New Zealand alone. At the start of the next World War, the New Zealand funds were reformed, having been criticized as overlapping, wasteful, and abused, but 11 were still functioning as of 2002. Now, many countries jailed those people who spoke out against the conflict. These included Eugene Debs in the U.S. and Bertrand Russell in Britain. In the U.S., the Espionage Act of 1917 and Sedition Act of 1918 made it a federal crime to oppose military recruitment or make any statements deemed disloyal. Publications at all critical of the government were removed from circulation by postal censors, and many served long prison sentences for statements of fact deemed unpatriotic, like Nelson Mandela. Basically, he served jail time for speaking out against acts against his own country. Muhammad Ali was stripped of his title because he refused to serve in the war. Now, several nationalists opposed intervention, particularly within the states that the nationalists were hostile to. Now, although the vast majority of Irish people consented to participate in the war in 1914 and 1915, a minority of advanced Irish nationalists had staunchly opposed taken part in it. Um, Now, the war began amid the Home Rule crisis in Ireland that had resurfaced in 1912. And by July of 1914, there was a serious possibility of an outbreak of civil war in Ireland. Irish nationalists and Marxists attempted to pursue Irish independence, culminating in the Easter Rising of 1916, with Germany sending 20,000 rifles to Ireland to stir unrest in Britain. No, I'm not. If I was in jail, I would not be able to stream any videos. Now, however, opposition to involvement in the war increased in Ireland, resulting in the conscription crisis of 1918. Here you see a photo of a town in Dublin, Ireland. It used to be called Sackville Street. Now it's called O'Connell Street, and this was after the 1916 Easter Rising in Dublin, Ireland. I'm actually in my own home, which is not jail at all. And if I was in jail, I would not be able to work UPS, and I work for UPS. So I would not be able to work UPS if I would not be at work at UPS if I was in jail. Now, other opposition came from unconscientious objectors. That's another term that's been used. Conscientious objectors. Now, some socialists, some religious who had refused to fight in Britain, 16,000 people asked for a conscientious objector status. Some of them, most notably prominent peace activist Stephen Hobhouse, refused both military and alternative service. Many suffered years of prison, including solitary confinement. Even after the war in Britain, many job advertisements were marked "No conscientious objectors need to apply." Between May 1st and May 4th of 1917, about 100,000 workers and soldiers of Petrograd, and after them, the workers and soldiers of other Russian cities, led by the Bolsheviks, demonstrated under banners reading "Down with the War" and "All power to the Soviets." The mass demonstrations resulted in a crisis for the Russian provisional government. In Milan, in May of 1917, Bolshevik revolutionaries organized and engaged in rioting, and they called for an end to the war, and they managed to close down factories and stop public transportation. Now, the Italian army was forced to enter Milan with tanks and machine guns to face Bolsheviks and anarchists, who fought violently until May 23rd, when the army gained control of the city. Now, almost 50 people, including 3 Italian soldiers, were killed, and over 800 people were arrested that day. Now, World War I began as a clash of the 20th century technology and the 19th century tactics, with the inevitably large ensuing casualties by the end of 1917. However, the major armies had modernized and were making use of telephone, wireless communication, armored cars, tanks, especially with the advent of the prototype tank, Little Willie, and aircraft carriers. Artillery also underwent a revolution. In 1914, cannons were positioned in the front line and fired directly at targets. By 1917, indirect fire with guns, as well as mortars and even machine guns, were commonplace, using new techniques for spotting and ranging, notably at aircraft and the field telephone. If they were able to take out aircraft and the field telephone, then nobody could take them out. The first picture right here on top is a plane. Royal Air Force, Sopwith Carmel. This was in April of 1917. The average life expectancy of a British pilot on the Western Front was 93 flying hours before they got shot down. Down here is Captain Marcel Cormes, pilot of the French 2nd Bombardment Group. Now, fixed-wing aircraft were initially used for reconnaissance and ground attack. To shoot down enemy planes, anti-aircraft guns and fighter aircraft were developed. Strategic bombers were created principally by the Germans and British, though the former used Zeppelins as well. towards the end of the conflict, um, aircraft carriers were used for the first time with HMS Furious launching Sopwith Camels in a raid to destroy the Zeppelin hangars at Tonder in 1918. Now, the non-military diplomatic and propaganda interactions among the nations were designed to build support for the cause to undermine support for the enemy. Now, for the most part, wartime diplomacy focused on 5 issues: propaganda campaigns, defining and redefining the war goals, which became harsher as the war went on, luring neutral nations, Italy, Ottoman Empire, Bulgaria, and Romania, into the coalition by offering slices of enemy territory, and encouragement by the allies of nationalistic minority movements inside the Central Powers, especially among the Czechoslovakians, Polish, and Arabs. In addition, multiple peace proposals were coming from neutrals on one side of the war, and none of them progressed very far. Now, memorials were built in thousands of villages and towns around different places. Um, now, memorials were built in thousands of villages and towns close to battlefields that of those buried at improvised burial grounds were gradually moved to formal graveyards under the care of organizations such as the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, the American Battle Monuments Commission, the German War Graves Commission, and Le Souvenir Francois. Many of these graveyards also have monuments to the missing or unidentified dead, such as the Menin Gate Memorial to the Missing and the Thiepval Memorial to the Missing of the Somme. Now here's an Italian Rita Puglia war memorial, which contains the remains of 100,000 and 187 soldiers. I'm not sure where that one is at. And here's a typical village war memorial to soldiers killed in World War One. This I'm not sure where that one is either. Now, in 1915, John McCrae, a Canadian Army doctor, wrote the poem in Flanders Fields as a salute to those who perished in the war. But it's still recited today, especially on Remembrance Day and Memorial Day, which I do not know that poem, never heard of it. There's a National World War I Museum and Memorial in Kansas City, Missouri. Is a memorial dedicated to all Americans who served in World War I. The Liberty Memorial was dedicated there on November 1st of 1921. The British government budgeted substantial resources to the commemoration of the war during the period of 2014 to 2018. The lead body is the Imperial War Museum. On August 3rd of 2014, French President Francois Hollande and German President Joachim Gauck together marked the century of Germany's declaration of war on France by laying the first stone of a memorial in Ville-Armand, known in German as Hartmann Swillerkopf, for French and German soldiers killed in the war. As part of the commemoration for the centenary for the 1918 armistice, French President Emmanuel Macron and German Chancellor Angela Merkel visited the site of the signing of the armistice of Company, and they unveiled a plaque to reconciliation. Now, the first efforts to comprehend the meaning and consequences of modern warfare began during the initial phases of the war and are still underway more than a century later. Teaching World War I has presented special challenges when compared with World War II. The First World War is often thought to be a wrong war fought for all the wrong reasons. That's just people's opinion, but it lacks the meta narrative of good versus evil that characterizes retellings of the Second World War, lacking recognizable heroes and villains. Um, it is often taught thematically and invoking simplified tropes that obscure the complexity of the context. Heather Jones argues that the historiography has been reinvigorated by a cultural turn in the 21st century. Scholars have raised entirely new questions regarding military occupation, um, radicalization of politics, race, medical science, gender, and mental health. Um, um, Now you have among the major subjects that historians have long debated regarding the war include why the war began and why the Allies won, whether generals were responsible for high casualty rates, and how soldiers endured the poor conditions of trench warfare, um, and to what extent the civilian home front accepted and endorsed the war effort. Um, Now, from here, we're going to go open up this here. Hold on. Now you have the Great Depression here that was mentioned on this. Um, the Great Depression was something that happened in 1929, which Herbert Hoover caused. Um, and we're gonna pull up the Great Depression here and coordinate this into the video. There's not this is not going to be a long video, particularly for Great Depression, because listed here there's not a big thing on it. But okay, so the Great Depression was a severe global economic downturn that lasted from 1929 to 1939. And the period was characterized by high rates of unemployment and poverty, drastic reductions in industrial production and international trade, and widespread bank and business failures all around the world. Now, the economic contagion began in 1929 in the United States, the largest economy in the world, with the devastating Wall Street crash of 1929, which often considered the beginning of the Depression. Among the countries with the most unemployment were the U.S., the United Kingdom, and Germany, that were all affected. Germany, so basically they were all affected by this. And here's a picture. Um, Unemployed people lined up outside a soup kitchen opened in Chicago by Al Capone on February of 1931. Sorry. Al Capone was a major gangster with the Chicago outfit, and then he was booted out because of some of the Valentine's Day massacre thing that that supposedly he ordered. Now update this picture, damn near 100 years later, and the picture will make sense because it's all Trump supporters now. Now, the Depression was preceded by the period of industrial growth and social development known as the Roaring Twenties. Now, there actually is a documentary called The Roaring Twenties on YouTube that particularly talks about the downfall of 1929, which the Great Depression started. Now, the Depression was preceded by a period of industrial growth and social development known as the Roaring Twenties, and much of the profit generated by the boom was invested in speculation such as the stock market, contributing to growth and equality. You're welcome, High Energy Ape. I love doing these type of videos because it helps everybody out. Now, banks were subject to minimal regulation, resulting in loose lending and widespread debt. By 1929, declining spending had led to reductions in manufacturing output and rising unemployment. Now, share values continued to rise until the October 1929 crash, after which the slide continued until July of 1932, accompanied by a loss of confidence in the financial system. By 1933, the U.S. Unemployment rate had risen to 25%, about 1/3 of farmers had lost their land, and about 9,000 of its 25,000 banks had gone out of business. Um, Now, the president then, Herbert Hoover, was unwilling to intervene heavily in the economy, and in 1930 he signed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, which would worsen the great. I already had a haircut. Now Herbert Hoover's presidential in the 1932 presidential election, Hoover was in 1930, Hoover signed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, which would worsen the Great Depression. Yes, I did. I got a haircut like a month ago, so I'm good. Now, in 1932 presidential in the 1932 presidential election, Hoover was defeated by Franklin Roosevelt, who from 1933 pursued a set of extensive New Deal programs in order to provide relief and create jobs. In Germany, which deepened heavily on the U.S. loans, the crisis caused unemployment to rise nearly 30%, and it fueled political extremism, paving the way for Adolf Hitler's rise to the Nazi Party. Now, between 1929 and 1932, worldwide gross domestic product, known as the GDP, fell by an estimated 15% in the U.S. The Depression resulted in a 30% contraction in GDP. I don't go to the gym. I just do a lot of walking. And walking is a great exercise for me. Now, recovery varied greatly around the world. Some economies, such as the U.S., Germany, and Japan, started to recover by the mid-1930s. Others, like France, did not return to pre-shock growth rates until later on in the decade. The Depression had devastating economic effects on both wealthy and poor countries. All experienced drops in personal income prices, like deflation, tax revenues, and profits. International trade fell by more than 50%, and unemployment in some countries rose as high as 33%. Now, cities around the world, especially those dependent on heavy industry, were heavily affected. Construction virtually halted in many countries, and farming communities and rural areas suffered as crop prices fell about 60%. Faced with plummeting demand and new job alternatives, areas dependent on a primary sector industry suffered the most. The outbreak of World War II in 1939 ended the Great Depression, as it stimulated factory production, providing jobs for women, as militaries absorbed large numbers of young unemployed men. Now, the precise causes for the Great Depression are disputed. One set of historians, for example, focuses on non-monetary economic causes. Among these, some regard the street crash itself as the main cause. Others consider that the crash was a mere symptom of more general economic trends at the time, which already had been underway in the late 1920s anyway. A contrasting set of views, which rose to prominence in the later part of the 20th century, ascribes a more prominent role to failures of monetary policy. According to those authors, while general economic trends can explain the emergence of the downturn, they fail to account for its severity and longevity, and they argue that these were caused by the lack of an adequate response to the crises of liquidity that followed the initial economic shock of 1929 and the subsequent bank failures accompanied by a general collapse of the financial markets. Now, if we look here, this is a graph back in 1929, between 1910 and 1960, of the unemployment rate. Right here, the blue right here in the middle. I can't read the year because it's too kind of small. It shows a 25% unemployment. And here's the Dow Jones Industrial Average back between 1920 and 1930. After the Wall Street crash in 1929, when the Dow Jones Industrial Average dropped from 381 to 198 over the course of 2 months. Um, the optimism persisted for some time. People were hesitant to put money in the stock market because of that crash. Um, now, the stock market rose a little bit in 1930, with the Dow returning to 294 pre-depression, pre the Great Depression levels in April 1930, before steadily declining for years to a low of 41 in 1932, and that was the lowest I think that anybody had ever seen it. At the beginning, governments and businesses spent more time in the first half of 1930 than in the corresponding period of the previous year. On the other hand, consumers, many of whom suffered severe losses in the stock market the previous year, cut expenditures by 10%. Now, in addition, beginning in the mid-1930s, a severe drought ravaged the agricultural heartland of the U.S. Now, interest rates dropped to low levels by mid-1930, but expected deflation and the continuing reluctance of people to borrow meant that consumer spending and investment remained low. By 1930, automobile sales declined to below the levels of 1928. Prices in general began to decline, although wages held steady in 1930. Then a deflationary spiral started in 1931, and farmers faced a worse outlook, declining crop prices. Declining crop prices and the Great Plains drought crippled their economic outlook. At its peak, the Great Depression saw nearly 10% of all Great Plains farms change hands despite federal assistance. At first, the decline in the U.S. economy was the factor that triggered economic downturns in most other countries due to a decline in trade. Capital movement and global business confidence, then an international weakness or strengths in each country, made conditions worse or better. For example, the UK economy, which experienced an economic downturn throughout most of the late 1920s, was less severely impacted by the shock of the Depression than the U.S. By contrast, the German economy saw a similar decline in industrial output as that observed in the U.S. Some economic historians attribute the differences in the rates of recovery and relative severity of the economic decline to whether particular countries had been able to effectively devaluate their currencies or not. Now, this is supported by the contrast in how the crisis progressed. In general, Britain, Argentina, and Brazil, all of which devalued their currencies early, and they returned to normal patterns of growth relatively rapidly in countries which stuck to the gold standard, such as France or Belgium. Now, frantic attempts by individual countries to shore up their economies throughout protectionist policies, such as the 1930 U.S. Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act and retaliatory tariffs in other countries, exacerbated the collapse in global trade, contributing to the Depression. By 1933, the economic decline pushed world trade to one-third of its level compared to 4 years earlier. Now here's a graph, a breakdown of change in economic indicators. Industrial production dropped to a negative 46%, in the United Kingdom 23%, in France negative 24%, and Germany 41%. And these were the states and countries that were affected by this. Now you can zoom in here and you can see the better numbers here. Then you see wholesale productions dropped to a negative 32%, and United Kingdom negative 33, France negative 34, Germany negative 29. Foreign trade for the United States negative 70, United Kingdom negative 60, France negative 54, and Germany negative 61. And employment rate negative 60, United Kingdom plus 607. That's a 607. Sorry. And then you get the idea. While the precise causes for the occurrence of the Great Depression are disputed and it can be traced both to global and national phenomena, its immediate origins are most conveniently examined in the context of the U.S. economy, from which the initial crisis spread to the rest of the world. In the aftermath of World War One, at the start of 1920, which was known as the Roaring Twenties, brought considerable wealth to the United States and Western Europe. But initially, the year 1929 dawned with good economic prospects at first, despite a minor crash on March 25th of 1929. The market seemed to gradually improve throughout until September, but stock prices began to slump in September and were volatile at the end of the month. A large sell-off of stocks began in mid-October, and finally on October 24th, known as Black Thursday, the American stock market crashed 11% at the opening bell. Actions to stabilize the market failed, and on October 28th, on Black Monday, the market crashed another 12%, and the panic peaked the next day on Black Tuesday, and when the market saw another 11% drop. Now, thousands of investors were ruined, and billions of dollars had been lost. Many stocks could not be sold at any price, and people weren't willing to buy. The market did recover 12% on Wednesday, but the damage had been done. Though the market entered a period of recovery from November 14th until April 17th of 1930, the general situation had been a prolonged slump. From September 29th to July 8th of 1932, the market lost 80% of its value. Now here's a picture of a crowd gathering at Wall Street before right after the 1929 crash. Despite the Wall Street crash, the worst of the crisis did not reverberate around the world until after 1929. The crisis hit panic levels again in December of 1930 with the bank run on the Bank of the United States, a former privately run bank bearing no relation to the U.S. government, not to be confused with the Federal Reserve. Unable to pay out to all of its creditors, the bank failed and had to be shut down. Among the 608 American banks that closed in November and December of 1930, the Bank of the United States accounted for a third of the total $550 million deposit loss, and with its closure, bank failures reached a critical mass. Now, the Smoot-Hawley Act and the breakdown of the International Trade Clause. In initial response to the crisis, the U.S. Congress passed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act on June 17, 1930, which made the Great Depression even worse. The act was ostensibly aimed at protecting the American economy from foreign competition by imposing high tariffs on the foreign imports. The consensus view among economists and economic historians, including Keynesians, monetarists, and Australian economists, is that the passage of the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act had in fact achieved an opposite effect to what it was intended for. It would make the Great Depression even worse by preventing economic recovery after domestic production recovery, hampering the volume of trade. Still, there is disagreement as to the precise extent of the Act's influence. In 1995 survey of American economic historians, 2/3 agreed that the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act had worsened the Great Depression. According to the U.S. Senate website, the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act is among the most catastrophic signings in congressional history. Now, many economists have argued that the sharp decline in international trade after 1930 helped to worsen the Great Depression, especially for countries significantly dependent on foreign trade. Now, most historians and economists blame the act for worsening the depression by seriously reducing international trade and causing retaliatory tariffs in other countries. while foreign trade was a small part of overall economic activity in the U.S. And was concentrated in a few businesses like farming, it was a much larger factor in many other countries as well. Um, um, Now, the average valorem value-based rate of duties on dutiable imports for 1921 to 1925 was a 26%, but under the new tariff it jumped to 50% during 1931 to 1935. In dollar terms, American exports declined over the next 4 years from about 5.2 billion in 1929 to 1.7 billion dollars in 1933. So not only did the physical volume of exports fall, but also the prices fell about one third as written. Hardest hit were farm commodities such as wheat, cotton, tobacco, and lumber. Um, Here's a picture of a crowd outside the ninth. Oh shit. Here's a picture of the crowds outside the Bank of the United States in New York after its failure in 1931. Now, governments around the world world took various steps into spending less money on foreign goods, such as imposing tariffs, import quotas, and exchange controls. These restrictions triggered much tension among countries that had large amounts of bilateral trade, causing major import, and reductions during the Great Depression. Not all governments enforced the same measures of protectionism, but not all governments enforced the same measures of protectionism at all. Now, um, some countries raised tariffs drastically and enforced severe restrictions on foreign exchange transactions, while other countries reduced trade and exchange restrictions only marginally. I've never been to Scotland, but I heard it's a beautiful country. Um, I live in the United States, and that's where I was born and raised at. That's where I've always been. I've never been to any foreign country as much as I would love to. Um, Now, countries that remained on the gold standard, keeping currencies fixed, were most likely to restrict foreign trade anyway. Um, Now, these countries resorted to protectionist policies to strengthen. They got a lot of history to the United States. Um, these countries resorted to protectionist policies to strengthen the balance of payments and limit gold losses. They hoped that these restrictions and depletions would hold the economic decline. Um, countries that abandoned the gold standard allowed their currencies to depreciate, which caused the balance of payments to strengthen. Yep, like some people have never left their country, and I've never left the United States. I've always lived in the United States, but never been outside of it. Um, Now, countries that abandoned the gold standard allowed their currencies to depreciate the value, depreciate, which caused their balance of payments to strengthen. But it also freed up monetary policy so that central banks could lower interest rates and act as lenders of the last resort. Now, they possessed the best best policy instruments to fight the depression, and they did not need protectionism. No, I'm Jewish. Um, Now, the length and depth of a country's economic downturn and the timing and vigor of its recovery are related to how it remained on the gold standard. Countries abandoning the gold standard relatively early experienced relatively mild recessions and early recoveries. In contrast, countries remaining on the gold standard experiencing prolonged slumps. Now, the gold standard was the primary transmission mechanism of the Great Depression. Um, even countries that did not face bank failures and a monetary contraction firsthand were forced to join the deflationary policy, since higher interest rates in countries that performed a deflationary policy that led and that led to a gold outflow on countries with lower interest rates. Under the gold standards price specified flow mechanism, countries that lost gold but nevertheless wanted to maintain the gold standard had to permit their money to supply to decrease and the domestic price level to decline deflation. Um, Now, some economic studies have indicated that the rigidities of the gold standard not only spread the downturn worldwide, but it also suspended gold, convertibly devaluing the currency in gold terms that did the most to make recovery possible. Every major currency left the gold standard during the Great Depression, but the UK was the first to do so, facing speculative attacks on the pound and depleting gold reserves. In the September of 1931, the Bank of England ceased exchanging pound notes for gold, and the pound was floated on foreign exchange markets. And Japan and Scandinavia would follow in 1931. Other countries such as Italy and the United States remained on the gold standard in 1931 to 1932, while a few countries in the so-called gold bloc, led by France, including Poland, Belgium, and Switzerland, stayed on that standard until 1935 and 1936. According to later analysis, the earliness with which a country left the gold standard reliably predicted its economic recovery. For example, the UK and Scandinavia, which left the gold standard in 1931, recovered much earlier than France and Belgium, which remained on gold much longer. Countries such as China, which had a silver standard, almost avoided the depression entirely. That connection between leaving the gold standard as a strong predictor of that country's severity of its depression and the length of time of its recovery has been shown to be consistent for dozens of countries, including developing countries. This partly explains why the experience and length of the depression differ between regions and states around the world. Now, the financial crisis escalated out of control in mid-1931, starting with the collapse of the credit Anstalts in Vienna in May. Now, this put heavy pressure on Germany, which was already in political turmoil. With the rise and violence of the National Socialists, known as the Nazi Party, and communist movements, as well as investor nervousness at harsh government financial policies. Investors withdrew their short-term money from Germany as confidence spiraled downward. The Reichsbank lost about 150 million marks in the first week of June, 540 million in the second, and 150 million in 2 days between June 19th and June 20th. A collapse was at hand. U.S. President Herbert Hoover, at that time, called for a moratorium on payment of war reparations. This angered Paris, which deepened on a steady flow of German payments, but it slowed the crisis down, and the moratorium was agreed to on July of 1931. An international conference in London, England, later in July produced no agreements, but on August 19th, a standstill agreement froze Germany's foreign liabilities for 6 months. Now, Germany received emergency funding from private banks in New York, as well as the Bank of International Settlements and the Bank of England. The funding only slowed the process. Industrial failures began in Germany. A major bank closed in July, and a 2-day holiday for all German banks were declared. Business failures were more frequent in July, and it spread to Romania and Hungary. The crisis continued to get worse in Germany, bringing up political upheaval that finally led to the coming to power of Hitler's Nazi regime in January 1933. I don't sing. At least not really, I don't. So the world financial crisis now began to overwhelm Britain. Investors around the world started withdrawing their gold from London at the rate of $2.5 million per day. The credits of $25 million each from the Bank of France and the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and an issue of $15 million fiduciary notes slowed, but it did not reverse the British crisis. The financial crisis now caused a major political crisis in Britain in August of 1931. With deficits mounting, the bankers demanded a balanced budget. The divided cabinet of Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald's Labour government agreed. It proposed to raise taxes, cut spending, and most controversially, cut employment benefits by 20%. The attack on welfare was unacceptable to the Labour movement. MacDonald wanted to resign, but King George V insisted insisted that he remain and form an all-party coalition known as the National Government. The Conservative and Liberal Party signed on, along with the small cadre of Labour, but the vast majority of Labour leaders denounced MacDonald as a traitor for leading the new government. Britain went off the gold standard and suffered relatively less than any other major country in the Great Depression. But in 1931 British election, the Labour Party was virtually destroyed, leaving MacDonald as a prime minister for a largely conservative coalition party. So in most countries of the world, recovery from the Great Depression began in 1933. In the U.S., recovery began in early 1933, but the U.S. did not return to 1929 GNP for over a decade, and still had an unemployment rate of about 50% in 1940, albeit being down from the high of 25% that was seen in 1933. So there is no consensus among the economists regarding the motif force for the U.S. Economic expansion that continued throughout most of the Roosevelt years and the 1937 recession that interrupted it. The common view among most economists is that Roosevelt's New Deal policies either caused or accelerated recovery, although his policies were never aggressive enough to bring the economy completely out of a recession. Some economists have also called attention to the positive effects from the expectations of reflation and rising nominal interest rates that Roosevelt's words and actions portended. Now, it was the rollback of those same reflationary policies that led to the interruption of a recession beginning in late 1937. One contributing policy that reversed the inflation was the Banking Act of 1935, which effectively raised reserve requirements, causing a monetary contraction that helped thwart the recovery. Now, GDP returned to its upward trend in 1938. A revisionist view among some economists holds that the New Deal prolonged the Great Depression, as they argue that the National Industrial Recovery Act of 1933 and National Labor Relations Act of 1935 restricted competition and established price fixing. Now, John Maynard Keynes did not think that the New Deal under Roosevelt single-handedly ended the Great Depression. It seems, politically impossible for a capitalistic democracy to organize expenditure on the sale necessary to make the grand experiment, which would prove case, except in war conditions. Now, during this time, the woman's primary role was being a housewife. Without a steady flow of family income, their work became much harder in dealing with food and clothing and medical care. Birth rates fell everywhere as children were postponed until families could financially support themselves. The average birth rate for 14 major countries fell 12% from 19.3 births per thousand population in 1930 to 17% in 1935. Now, in Canada, half of Roman Catholic women defied church teachings and they used contraception to postpone births. Okay, I'm going to leave it here, and I'm going to pick this up next week. Starting tomorrow, I'll be going to college, so I'm going to be busy Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. I might not be back until Friday for a video to finish up the Great Depression talk. So we're going to do a Great Depression Part 2 next week, starting on Friday. I'll see you guys then. So if you like the video, give the live stream video a like and subscribe to my channel, Rusty the King, and also make sure to smash that like and subscribe button if you want more videos like this. And thanks for all the people that commented that aren't trolls anyway. I'll see you next week.